I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about using your competitors to supercharge your search. Becky mentioned this is a talk that I've done at Brighton SEO, but it's one of my favourite topics, and I think it's a very underappreciated resource that we have as marketers to ensure that we're really capitalising on the performance we can gain with our campaigns. So I want to start us off by taking a moment to sit and think about those moments where you have launched a new campaign, you have produced some piece of content, or you've done a new strategy, and the performance that you've seen just hasn't been what you had expected. You've had a look in all of the background, the setup's correct, everything makes sort of sense in terms of what you were expecting, but you've just not had that performance. You've had that light bulb moment, which I've had many times, where you realise that, you know what, this may not actually be anything to do with what we have done as a team or as a business. And I think that this quote here from Clint Eastwood during more of his political days is a really nice one to demonstrate not only that point, but also what I'm going to talk about today. It's not about you, it's about them. Them being your competitors and also your customers, because obviously that has a massive impact in terms of what you're doing. So again, take a moment to think about how many brands this year you have either been newly exposed to or you've tried as a new brand. So these are some examples of the brands that I've maybe either been newly exposed to or ones that I've actually engaged with recently in the last sort of six to 12 months or so. Some two nice examples to demonstrate the importance of understanding what is important to your customers is I've been an avid user of eBay for many years for my pre-loved fashion source. But more recently, and I'd say in about the last 6 months or so, Vinted, which was a brand I was sort of aware of but hadn't really engaged with, became something that I've actually really enjoyed shopping with. It's given me an alternative option to purchase pre-loved items, which is different to what eBay offers, but it has meant I have used eBay a lot less than I had done previously. Blinkist is another really good example. I love Audible. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But in the last sort of 6 months, again, 7, 8 months or so, Blinkist was a brand that one of my friends introduced me to and actually really opened my opportunities for audio listening. So I drive a lot in the car, so it's nice to have either audiobooks, but actually now I can start to listen to other types of content whilst I do that drive. So whilst I am still using Audible to a large extent, Blinkist now is one of those other brands that when I'm sitting there thinking, what do I want to listen to, I'm not necessarily defaulting to Audible. And you'll know, I'm sure, when what I've just talked through, that I'm not alone, but neither are you in that sense of that many brands that you've recently engaged with or started to consider in your consideration set. There's also an alien in there because I thought I needed to put that in there as a nod. So 71% of people have switched brands at least once in the last year. So, that's a huge number of proportion of people. 70% of people will switch brands for a higher perceived quality alternative. So again, it doesn't really matter necessarily whether your product has changed, but if there's a perception that someone else's product might be a better quality, then there's a risk there. 66% of people will switch because of better deals. And obviously, the current economic situation, this applies not only from a B2C perspective, like people from their personal circumstances, but also, as we know, in a business circumstance as well. People are constantly looking for better deals as their budgets are constantly being squeezed. And as part of that, people are looking to constantly sort of make their decisions based on their new personal circumstances as that switches as well. So whilst it's a smaller proportion, it still shows that indication that there's that necessity for people to maybe make decisions not based on what they want from maybe an emotional perspective, but what they need to do instead. And if you also think about the fact that you can have up to typically 5 brands in your consideration set, that's a lot of brands. So your competition is really high. And humans are both fickle and they're biased at the same time, which makes decision-making influenced by a variety of different factors whenever someone's making that choice. And a lot of people here will be familiar with Google's messy middle, and it's a really nice way to visualize that challenging position that we're in from marketers' perspective to try and influence that decision-making through that exploration and evaluation phases. And at Reflect, we use the COM-B model for behavioural change, which stands for COM-B standing for capability, opportunity, motivation, which then ultimately, by having all of those 3 factors, you will be able to see that behaviour happen. If there are any kind of barriers to any of those 3, so barriers for capability, opportunity, or motivation, that could be a reason why you're not necessarily seeing the desired behaviour that you want. And that's a really important thing to consider when we're looking at how we're trying to achieve the desired outcome with our marketing activity. And as I mentioned, there are so many different factors that will influence decision. And quite often we will focus on the more practical, rational decision-making processes without necessarily considering how much emotion can really come into this. And that's not just from a consumer perspective. So we might automatically think that. if someone's buying something on a retail perspective, like there could be an emotional attachment. But even in a business context, there will be an emotional attachment to those decision-making processes that really matters to them as an individual, as well as from a more of a business context as well. But I've just got some examples here of the typical kinds of factors which can influence that decision-making. As I said, that emotional side, experience, and again, that could be anything from your own experience to someone who knows experience, and that could be good or bad, which ultimately could influence the decision that you're making. Social influence, which we're all very familiar with, and how much that can impact people's decision making, but also things like decision fatigue and default decision, where people will make decisions based on what's the most easiest route for them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these elements later on. So what factors are currently influencing your consumers' decisions? And if you don't know the answer to that question, that's really one of the key ones. So going back to that original point about, can your search performance be judged on your tactics alone? And hopefully you agree with me, the answer is no. So that hopefully will give you your own light bulb moment when you're in that position and being asked, what's gone wrong here? Why hasn't this worked? What have you done? It's not necessarily about what you had done. It's understanding what's going on in the marketplace around you. And from the second half of what we're going to talk about today should give you the tools and the approach that you need in order to be able to come to that question with the right answers. So to start with, you need to keep your finger on the pulse of your customers' needs and the competition's strategy and their tactics, because if you think about the fact that they're potentially constantly changing what they're up to, same way that we're potentially doing the same thing, we need to be aware of what that is. So, excuse me, so let's look at examples. So as I mentioned, so many brands ultimately will do the same thing. So I know as when we love our brand, we're like, we've got our USPs, but quite often, majority of the brands are fundamentally at the core really offer the same thing with some nuances within there. So I've got quite experience with working with experiential gifting brands. So we're just going to have a little look at some of these examples. And these are really nice ones because the breadth of the types of products that they offer is so huge. So we're going to have a quick look at Red Letter Days, Virgin Experience Days, and Buy a Gift. And actually, if you look at the homepage of these three brands, whilst actually in this example, the percentage discount is slightly different, which is in itself important. If you look at the navigation of the website and the basic offers that they are providing, they all provide the same thing. They all offer things like driving experiences, dining experiences, short breaks, flying experiences, whatever it might be. Ultimately, they all offer the same thing. If we then take a step back to the sort of shop window, if you like, when someone's searching on Google or Microsoft and looking for an answer to the solution to their challenge, we can then start to see what they're being confronted with at the very beginning. So at the top here, we've got the example of Red Letter Days. And within this is an ad, text-based ad that we're showing here. But as we'll talk about in a moment, this is still super relevant for SEO as well. Within the ad here, from their headline and the description lines, they focus on credibility with using official in the headline, but also availability and validity. So the vouchers are available for 12 months and you get the next day delivery. Moving down to Buy a Gift. They focus a bit more on that validity, so that's very much been prominent in that headline with the vouchers being valid for 12 months. But they go down a really much more emotional route of give a loved one a unique and special present for all occasions. How sweet is that? And then if you move down to Virgin Experience Days, they again move more into the range and discounts. So they've got thousands of unique and wonderful experiences, and they have sort of mentioned that discount on the ad itself as well. So when you look at those ads at their very core and sort of analyze it very sort of structurally, they speak to very different needs. But then the question is, which one of those is most important? Thinking about what impact that message has on the consumers, and all of a sudden we had three different offerings where, for example, when we looked at the more emotive language, if that's somebody who's actually looking to try and gift for their loved one, that is something that would probably speak more to their focus area versus maybe someone who is more price dependent and price focused. So ultimately, these brands have used nudges to encourage behaviour, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page, a nudge is a small tweak to an environment that can have a positive and big impact on behaviour without limiting choice. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these nudges and consider the mental shortcuts or biases which influence the decisions that we make. So these are really nice examples which relate to the experiential gifting space. So we've got here choice overload. So when you're giving too many choices to people, that people find it difficult. We all know, we can think of that ourselves if we sit down and consider that. If we're overwhelmed with the amount of choice and variety that we have, sometimes that can stop and prevent us from making a decision. And if we look at one of the ads that we showed earlier, we're talking about thousands of products available. Well, do I want to sift through thousands of products? The answer is no. So it's about kind of condensing that into a manageable number, which still provides range, but doesn't feel overwhelming. Scarcity effect. So this is one actually that we're very sort of well versed at using within the marketing space, where people assign higher value to items that they perceive as being limited. So that's why we use things like countdown timers or limited offers, for example, because it gives that feeling of urgency to not miss out. And then present bias, where people prioritize short-term rewards over some of those long-term gains. I think this is, again, very interesting in the example of the experiential gifting, where we're looking at the focus on the 12-month validity. Now, how actually important is that 12-month validity for a voucher versus the discount that someone would immediately get if they purchase a product with that particular brand over an alternative? Now, during COVID, this was obviously a really big thing. People wanted that extended voucher validity. The question is that still something that's super important to customers when they are purchasing these sorts of products? So that's a bit about the theory, and now I'm going to go into a little bit more about the practical elements of how you can actually go about putting some of this together and help support your own marketing strategy. So to start with, like any good scientist, you observe. So you look at your competition and your customers. So you firstly look at what did they do in the past. And again, we can be quite forgetful of actually looking historically at what's been going on. So what kind of offers were they showing previously? What kind of messaging have they used? What kind of products are they focusing on as a business? Then look at what are they doing now. Obviously, this is the here and now, and that's super relevant for our customers. But understanding then how does that differ from what they were doing to where they are today? And then what do we think that they might do in the future? The more challenging part of it is that hypothesis of, okay, well, what do we think they might be up to in the next year? What do we think that their marketing strategy might be for the next year? Because obviously that's really important information we will need to know to help us understand what we need to be doing for our own. There are so many different sources of information that you can use to acquire this data. So from a competition perspective, things like auction insights from your Google Ads accounts. You can look at doing competitor audits. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to go about that process in more detail in a moment. Ad reviews, which kind of comes into that audit element as well. USP monitoring, rankings monitoring, keyword coverage, brand search strategy. You know, what are they doing there? They're all super easy ways to try and start to get some of that additional information. And from a customer's perspective, you know, understanding those search trends, using search trends to look at that. Social listening. So, you know, this can be, as I'll talk about in a moment, through third-party tools, or even, you know, just taking the time to kind of look at what's going on with your competitors. Customer surveys, so getting that first-hand information from your customers on a regular basis. Website engagement audits, messaging testing, customer journey maps. And actually, I think that's another really important area that we often overlook when we are trying to understand what best to be doing. And as I mentioned, one of the kind of baseline elements of taking this approach is understanding where you're going to get that data from. And there are a variety of different sources of information, some of which are here. There are more of these as well. But as I said earlier, this doesn't have to be an expensive task. So some of these are paid for tools. Otherwise, you are able to do some of this manually yourself, or use kind of relatively cheap tools in order to acquire that information. And another point that I think is super important that I think brands quite often forget is identifying who your search competition is. Now, that can differ from who your business competitors set are. So I can't count the number of times we've been in sort of a situation where it's like, oh, well, these are our competitors that we focus on as a business. This is what we're looking at from a board level. This is who we're interested in. But when we look at our search, our auction insights, for example, we actually look at who's appearing next to us in the search results page. They could be completely different, or there could be other brands in there that just hadn't been considered. In this case, well, they're not our competition. Well, they are your competition because they are appearing against you in that search results page. Your consumers are being confronted with both those brands at the same time. That brand has decided, intentionally or otherwise, to appear for that search term at that time. So your role is still to compete to an extent with that competitor. So understanding what they're doing is still really important. A really good example of this is Amazon. And I think a lot of brands are like, oh, it's Amazon, like they're a bear moss. We're never going to, what's the point in worrying about what they're up to? You're not necessarily going to be able to do anything about it, but it's still super important to understand what are Amazon up to, what approach are they taking, when are they appearing against us, because that ultimately will potentially have quite a big impact in terms of the performance that you're seeing. So I think that's really vital to remember. Don't disregard brands because either they're too big or they're not considered as a standard competitor. It's about who actually are your consumers being confronted with at that point of consideration. So once you've decided on the data sources you're using, then the frequency of data acquisition is also super important. And that will depend on the types of tools you're using, but also the size of your team, how much time you've got available to you. But I would still say, regardless of whether you go on a more granular level or on a larger scale, you're still going to get so many valuable insights just by starting to implement some of these ideas. So a really simple version of doing this, obviously, you can use some of these fancy tools, is literally just taking some screenshots of the search results page. You just note down like when this was obviously taken, time of day and day of week, date of the actual screenshot. And then you're starting to copy down like what did the different ads or listings show to that person when someone searched, when you searched on that page, what did it say? And what did your content say relative to the competitors? And by building out even in a deck format, so you can have this like a different page per day, or however frequently you're doing it, we're then going to start to build up that picture. And as long as you're kind of analysing that data, you're then going to be able to start to understand a little bit more about how that's changing potentially through time. And then another key area to consider is reviewing your customer needs on at least a quarterly basis. Again, a lot of brands will look at things on an annual basis. It's like we'll do a review on an annual level. The challenge with that is that we know people change so much so quickly. The situation changes so rapidly that if you're not necessarily keeping your finger on what's going on a more shorter term basis, you're going to miss some of those sort of nuances and how things have changed over that year. So reviewing it at least on a quarterly basis, doing search and social listening will help you understand what has changed in the last 3 months that actually could really impact your own strategy. And ultimately, with all of this, you're building a bank of insights and knowledge. So the idea isn't that you're going to be able to go away tomorrow and be like, bang, I'm going to get all this insight straight away. The idea is that you're starting to build up that repository of information that you can then utilize at a later stage to inform what you're doing. So a really nice example, we're kind of very, very topical, as mentioned about kind of coming up to Christmas. So you've got the lovely period of Black Friday. So obviously for any retail e-commerce or any brands for whom that's irrelevant, equally for travel coming into January or any other sector when you've got your peak periods, financial year end. By starting to build up that bank of information now, let's say for Black Friday, you could start either on a daily or at least weekly basis. I'd say as you're getting closer to Black Friday, doing it on a daily basis is recommended, because you'll see that brands are going to start to change their offerings, their strategy potentially as they're going into that period. But starting to look at not only the ad copy, but what channels they're appearing on. So it might be that they've integrated YouTube into their strategy for this peak period, which they don't typically do. It's really useful to then have all of that information, which you can then utilize. So whilst you might not be able to action anything this time round, although you might be able to make some changes, because I have worked with brands where it's a case of like we've gone through this process, we've identified that discounts have differed maybe with one brand compared to what we're offering. We've had to make a decision as to whether we're going to try and compete with that or if we're going to go down a different route. But ultimately, you're going to store that information either for next year, but equally, you can still use this information and insight for other peak periods as they come through. But it's a really good exciting opportunity to start this process right away. So then once you've done that, you can then start to plan. So consider all of the factors that influence the decision. So really sitting down and going through that process of understanding. So when we offer a promotion, obviously from our perspective, it's like, oh, that's great as a standalone piece. But there are so many different factors that will come into play. And when you're a consumer, particularly if you're deal focused or really aware of price, some of these other elements here could be more important. So they're actually going to have a bit more insight into what the sort of small print essentially is around that promotion. And then when you're structuring your calendar, your content calendars, with your own KPIs in mind, so you're looking here at creating like what content are we creating relative to each of the months. Is a very simple, simplified version. But alongside that, again, if we're looking from a retail perspective, you've got your promotions that you're then going to say, like we're going to do, say, like 25% site-wide discount. You might have Mother's Day discount codes, 2-for-1 weekend trips, whatever it might be. That's all great. And then the enhancing of that is an overlaying from what your competitor research has shown you. So then all of a sudden you've got not only your content calendar, but you've also got your competitors' content calendars overlaid. So from that approach of understanding, okay, what did they do last year? Now we can start to fill in the gaps of what we think they might be going to be doing this year. What discounts did they run previously? What do we think they might be going with this year? And then obviously we can compare that to what we're actually going to be approaching ourselves. We'll start to identify differences potentially in the offering. And again, if we think about the fact that if you're then going to be, from a consumer perspective, confronted with these two offers, what kind of impact do we think that that's going to have on the response rates to our ads or our content or creative? And then you test. But remember that the variables you're testing are not just your own. So again, when you're in that situation of testing, it's like, oh, well, we've got these tests, but it hasn't performed the way we thought it would. But actually, you're only looking at two elements of that variable. There are so many other factors that are out of your control that are happening at the same time. And your tests are at least two-sided, because it looks nice on this side. But they're at least two-sided. So you're testing your copy against itself, but you're also testing it against what your competitors are up to as well. And then finally, you will evaluate. So we've got an example here of using click-through rates, where we have plotted over our own brand promotion, where we can see that uplift in click-through rate off the back of that. What you can then do, obviously, with that competitor insight research that you've done, is then overlay your competitor brand's promotion. What kind of impact did that then have on the click-through rate we were seeing with our campaigns? And then you can explore the impact your message has had on the engagement you're seeing, and then ultimately decide how your strategy needs to adapt to what's going on around you, allowing you to be both strategic and responsive, which is so important, particularly as we're finding people are things not static and are constantly changing. And this strategy ensures that your brand can remain responsive to the market changes of your competition, but also of your customers' needs, which will also be adapting. So to quickly recap, sorry. The four main stages that we work through is about observing. So first of all, observe your customers and your competition. Keep an eye on what they're up to, because chances are they're probably doing the same to you. Plan based on the research. Think about what you're going to be doing and use that information to really solidify and make those decisions around your strategy. Testing. So consider all of the variables that are coming into play. When you're kind of evaluating something, obviously don't just be too focused on exactly what's going on from the perspective of what you've been doing, but also think about what else is happening around you. And then finally, evaluate with your competition in mind. So when you're looking at what the results are showing you, just think about, okay, what tactics and strategies have we personally taken, what have we done in our accounts that we've changed this year versus previously, but include those insights you've got from your competition as well. And as I mentioned, you can start as big or as small as you like. So this isn't, it doesn't mean that you've got to have huge budgets to be able to do this. It can be really simple. So things like the Google Transparency Center, doing a simple SERP review, but there are other channels as well that you can use that you can pay for, which can give additional insights. Looking at the cadence of when you're going to be doing this, so monthly or weekly, generally speaking, is more than sufficient. But if you're coming into a peak period, you might want to consider daily. And then what's really important is it's all and good having all this data and information, but it's the action off the back of it that's so important. So you're creating that repository of changes that you're tracking, you're reviewing it on a weekly basis, and then you're deciding what the actions are off the back of that to make sure that what you're making the most of that information and data that you've got available to you. And the biggest risk associated, in my opinion, with ignoring that environment, there are quite a few really. So reduced credibility. So as we know, if we're not able to understand how to speak to our customers because we're not listening to what they're saying, then that ultimately will mean that we are less credible in the marketplace versus our competitors. Sorry, we're losing market share. Ultimately, if your competitors are able to adapt more easily to the environment because they have made more of that effort to look at their customers and what's going on around them, then ultimately you're going to be losing out on that opportunity as they're growing their market share. They're taking that from somewhere. You'll become less relevant because you're not staying in touch and listening to what's going on. And again, that's so important for customers to feel that you are listening to them, the authentic, but you're also up to date and relevant. It will stunt your growth ultimately, because if you are losing that market share, you're not gaining that market share. And ultimately, your competitors are capitalizing on that opportunity. And that lack of innovation, which I think is super important. We're all, again, very capable of looking at what's going on in our own four walls. What can be the real ultimate game changer is when you're looking outside of that of what's going on, and that can really help drive that innovation. Another interesting point, actually, I forgot to mention earlier on, is around not only with your competitors being that kind of direct competitor set of those brands that are ones that are in your sector, but also looking outside of that, who else within a similar product type or similar type of journey, customer journey that might be going through. What can you learn from those experiences as well that you can also use? But ultimately, like keeping your eye around what's going on, not just on what you're doing yourselves, will help with that innovation as well. So hopefully I've given you lots of food for thought, and lots of opportunity to kind of go away and either start something even today, or if not today, then maybe tomorrow. And ultimately, I want you to go away with remembering that quote from the beginning, that it's not about you, it's about them. And that's, with that in mind, you can only go from strength to strength with your marketing strategy. So thank you so much for listening. There are you can download the slides, I think, although you get the slides, I think, sent to you anyway. But we also have got a performing and tracking a training program, which I found very difficult to say, which is coming up in the new year, which is super exciting. So myself and a couple of other guys in the team will be going through this training program, covering a variety of different topics, I think, on here. So GTM tracking, advanced GA4, behavioural science and data, if you want to find out more about how to unearth some of these insights. Things like, using it for customer journey mapping, etc. Also things like data storytelling, so really helping people to better tell the narrative of what they're trying to say internally to their stakeholders as well as their customers. So yeah, the spaces are limited, so please do check it out and sign up soon so you don't miss out.